And he said, yeah, I had a young player run into a problem. There was a situation, and in order to get further with whatever the thing was, you had to solve a puzzle. And so the character was like, what do I need to roll to know how to solve the puzzle? And the dungeon master was like, keep rolling those dice, and I'm going to get a drink. And then when I get back, nothing will have changed, because you don't get to roll dice to solve this problem. You have to figure it out on your own, and so that's the difference, is like all these lore rolls and, rolls to know what you don't know. And that is just like video game on paper. And that's part of the problem, is that a lot of the designers that are designing RPGs now for the big companies are coming out of the video game industry. So they're gamifying everything like a computer program.
Hi, welcome to the Daiku podcast. I'm here with Griffith Morgan today, and Griffith is one half of the Fellowship of the Thing, and one of the creators behind the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, and his most recent project is the Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, as he's holding up there. And we're going to get into all of that today. And first of all, welcome, Griffith.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I'm really psyched, actually. I don't think I know very much about you. You kind of showed up on the radar maybe a month ago. And you were like, hey, you want to do a show with me? I was like, okay.
Well, maybe you forgot, but I did the documentary on the world's largest game store, the Sentry Box, in Calgary, Alberta. And and you were
I talked to so many people, unless I know your face. Now I know what you look like more. And so I don't know your name. I'll never remember it. So don't tell me what it is.
And so anyways, you were instrumental, and I kind of missed the deadline, and you put in a good word for me to get me after the deadline to get me into the Gen Con Film Festival. So I thank you for that. And I said that publicly on Twitter. I said, thank you. And you said, well, just pay it forward. And I've always said, well, I'd love to have you on the show. And now is a great time.
That's the thing, is I just really am wanting to create, as much as I see people talk about things like community and gaming and such. I don't see people actually, like, community is a really simple thing, which is kind of like, I got your back.
Yeah.
And so, and that just to me means, like, if I see somebody just post their latest game that they're selling on drive-through or a Kickstarter, I'll just retweet it, and I'll make sure, I'll just be like, like, I'm doing it, you got to do it too. We just got to, like, it's your job to retweet this as well. You may not want this, but somebody will, and it's going to help the person who's doing this thing. And they're tiny, they're not going to make millions of dollars, but it'd be kind of cool if they could, I don't know, sell 200 copies of their game or whatever they're doing,
And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I started my channel, was to explore game design, offer tips from experts in their field, as well as highlight some of the lesser known designers out there. And I just finished off, you probably didn't see, but I finished off doing Halloween. I did a zine review of a small creator every day.
Okay, yeah. I know the name, I think.
Yeah. So, but anyways, enough about me. Let's get on to.
Well, it's kind of fun to talk about you too. I mean, maybe you're doing something cool and we don't even know about it, right?
Everybody on the channel's sick of me. So let's talk about the talent.
No, but you got me going on that whole, like, the idea of community and all that. Yeah. And that was kind of one of the things I've been like, I don't know. It's just like, it's up to you to amplify all these indies. If you consider yourself part of this community, the way you are part of the community is you amplify the indies that are working on stuff, and just try to stay positive and don't be nasty and mean. I mean, I'm really sarcastic, and a lot of people misunderstand my sarcasm as me being mean, but I'm just clowning around most of the time and laughing a lot, But anyway, let's go on. We want to talk about gaming,
sure.
I think.
Well, let's go back. Like I said, you did the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, which is a huge success. But tell us just the synopsis of that documentary, and then how that led into your new project.
The synopsis of the documentary is basically that a bunch of guys get together. They're into wargaming, and they're searching for a way. This is before computers and stuff like that, and it's all on a tabletop with miniatures, and they're searching for ways to instill the sense of the fog of war into their war games. And so they start implementing all these methods for fog of war, and it ends up evolving into what ends up being D&D. I mean, they invented it. Gary didn't invent role playing. He didn't know what role playing was. I mean, I see people try to sort of go back into history and adjust things like, well, we ran this game and there was this thing and that thing, and it's like, yeah, but they weren't role playing. I mean, they were role playing, but they weren't role playing to the extent that Arneson and his group were doing it, because they were just like off the hook.
And so that was like early formative primordial days of what role playing was. And you interviewed all these folks that participated in retrospect, looking back upon that time. And they shared the creation story basically of role playing.
Yeah, that was kind of the thing, is that we were really, I wrote it and edited it and directed it. And so, which is pretty amazing, because we did it in like 6.5 years, which if you know anybody that does like long form documentaries, they will all tell you it took them 10 years to make their first documentary. So we did it in about 2/3 of that time. And anyway, so I lost the thread there, but we just went out and we went and talked to them and really investigated what they were doing, and then sort of presented, that's where I come in as the writer and narrator, is I sort of explain what they're doing in a way that you can understand it, because a lot of times they don't even have the words to explain it. Like one of the things that my sister was the assistant editor, and she just finally one day, she was like, Griff, you got to look at what the women are saying. They're saying like really cool stuff. And I was like, like, I'm a war gamer, so I'm watching the wargaming stuff, and it's all the dudes. So I went and watched Gaylord's interview, and she, at one point, she said, it was all make believe, and that was the best part. And I was like, oh my God, wait a minute, she's the one that's saying what it really is, right? And so, so that's kind of, I don't know. I mean, it was interesting, that interplay, and realizing that what they were saying, like the women weren't necessarily the people driving the games, but they were there, if not even in the games, they were on the sidelines watching what the guys were doing. And so they were able to sort of interpret it in a much clearer manner than the guys that were involved in it, because they were too close to it,
And then throughout the documentary, the Tonisborg dungeon came up on occasion, and people had thought that was lost, right?
Yeah, that's one of those weird ones. I see, I wasn't aware of it because I wasn't really that tied into the research community until I started doing the movie. And there's just so much stuff to learn just to get up to speed. I remember once talking to John Peterson, and I made this assertion, and he was like, dude, that's old. We've already debunked that like 5 years ago. You got to get up to speed, And I was sort of like, you jerk, you're being mean to me. And so I went back and I was like, okay, he's right. I got to bone up on this stuff and not come off as a like idiot, And so, I mean, there's just so much out there. I mean, that's the thing, is people want this whole story to be sort of tucked into this neat little package. You're talking about a lot of different phases in the creation of role-playing games. There's sort of there's the invention stage, there's sort of a development stage. Once they know what they've sort of invented, they're developing this, and they come up with multiple role-playing games. It's not just, I think that people like, that's these tags like role-playing game doesn't even fit the game, and it doesn't make sense calling it a role-playing game, because that's not what it is. And but anyway, so you have a development stage, and then you have like they're prototyping, and then they're kind of past prototyping, and they're like just trying to develop the actual product, which is where Gary Gygax comes in. He was really essential for that stage, and as the editor, he kind of drove what it became in terms of like, well, these little guys here.
Oh, you still got them, hey? Yeah.
Yeah, these are like a white box set,
Yeah.
so they're not they're not worth $1 million. They're just, this is what I played with as a kid. Like, you can even see, I think my scrawly, look at that. My scrawly signature is in there, Griffith Morgan, M. Morgan.
Oh, right on.
My 14-year-old signature. It's hilarious.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, you said you wouldn't you know, the role-playing game title, what would you call it if it isn't
Well,
role-playing?
well, I would define it by, I mean, that was one of the things that I, in the film, do, is I think it's important to get some sort of definitions for things as far as so that you can like, trying to look, I get too complicated with words. Let's use a simple word. You need to understand what the different things are so that you can define what the thing is, like, so you can measure it, you know. I guess like, yeah, like you need a ruler to measure what the role playing is. And basically what most of the research that I was seeing, well, all of the research, it was like, either it was Dungeons and Dragons, and anything that was Dungeons and Dragons or later was a role-playing game, or it was proto role-playing. And this was a problem the linguists ran into. Linguists used to, you know, it was like either it's a language or it's a proto-language, but they didn't actually have a definition for what a proto-language is. So it's like, oh, so you're just going to throw out this term, and people are just going to assume in their own head what that is, but nobody knows what that is. So what I did was I sort of went in and I said, okay, if we see any kind of role-playing, we're going to call it a role-playing game. And then we're going to come up with at least some broad terms for what kind of role-playing game it is. And so, you know, initially where you're seeing it, I mean, it comes down from the Kriegspiel games, the Prussian games, and but there's a bottleneck. I mean, it's sort of I apply a lot of ideas that have to do with anthropology and in terms of like there's a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck in the design, in the creation of role-playing games, because the guys in the Twin Cities never saw Kriegspiel. They only had one book. And so the guy they were looking at was Totten, Charles Adiel Lewis Totten, who was this American who designed this game that was used as a it was a training game for military officers between the Civil War and whatever came after. I mean, we had this miraculous time where we weren't at war with anybody. It was like, we're just not going to conquer anybody. Well, that's weird. But we need an army, so we need to train our officers, and most of the officers are really old because they fought in the Civil War. We got to do something. So Totten created this game, and what he was doing was there were several schools of thought about how to run a war game. And so there's even like the ideas about a game should be deterministic. So it's more like chess in that, you know, if my heavy cavalry attacks your light infantry, these are the losses you're going to take always, right? And my troops just do what I tell them to do because that's the way we run this game. And then there was another school of thought that was the free Kriegspiel. They call it free Kriegspiel. I don't know if they call it that back then. I haven't been able to find.
I think it was just Kriegspiel at that point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of terminology that's been added since. Anyway, so you have this stage of the war game with role playing in it, and excuse me, and so that's important to know, and it's important to be able to say, okay, this is a kind of war game or a role playing game. The next stage would be, what did I do? They were doing that. Probably the domain game idea, empire games, which are the games where everybody is the leader of a country. Like, and you also have to pay attention to the scale. So in a war game, everybody's playing like a colonel or a general or something in an army, and they're moving the troops around. You go to the domain games, and you go up a notch, and now you're the kings, or the kings, the king's foreign policy advisors or whatever, and you're playing a game where you're dealing with economics, and you're dealing with some really grand strategic scale stuff of like, we're moving an army over here, but we're not dealing with the little fiddly details of the armies fighting. And so there's that stage. There's a stage in wargaming where they go really small. That would be like Corns. And that's still like a role-played war game. And that's kind of one of the things within the research that I thought was really flawed, was people got obsessed with the scale issue, and they were like, well, Corns is a man-to-man game, so it's already a role-playing game. It's like, yeah, but they're not, what they're doing in a game is not actually the same kind of role-playing. They haven't really broken any boundaries as far as it being more than just moving pieces on a board and pretending to be your guys. And one of the things I noticed when I read Corns is that the people who played it after they bought it liked to play in groups, and so they would have a couple people on a side and play a game. And if you read the game, it does not say that. It literally, it's pretty heavily implied that you have a player A versus a player B and a referee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the other thing. I mean, it's like such a broad subject, you know, of what is this. Referees seem to be a key element within all of this. You cannot do a role-playing game without a referee. So you'll see the referee in all of these role-playing games. And so then it was Wesley who really broke through and created a different kind of role-playing game. And he created a game where you were an individual and you had objectives, and you would talk to other individuals because it wasn't a war game. You would talk to people, and you could interact with them and negotiate with them. And you know, you were trying to find out information. You were trying to get objects. Maybe you were trying to do somebody in, but the focus wasn't shooting people, and that's pretty miraculous. And so, and in the case of his game, if you look at it, you can look at it in terms of like a movie or a play structure. And so it's a very character based. It's each character interacting with each character. The referee is there to adjudicate. The referee establishes the setting, establishes everything. Players come in, they play. The referee adjudicates what's going on, but for the most part, the referee is very hands off. And it's just the players interacting for hours on end. Exchanging things and whatever, being, you know, whatever you do as your character. So that was kind of that's a miraculous point in time when Wesley creates that. And then you've got another stage where you have would be Dwayne Jenkins is the first one who he takes the Wesley format, and Wesley set all of his games, or he set his original game in the time of Napoleon in an imaginary Prussian town called Brownstein. And and then he did some others, and Dave Arneson also became a referee because Wesley wanted to play his own game. It's like everybody was having a blast. He's like, I want to play my game too. So Dave Arneson stepped in and became a Brownstein referee, and he mostly ran like Banania games, I think, which was a fictitious South American country that's right. Like all of these are sort of like you're in a place and there's like political upheaval, and so it's like, which way is the country going to go, you know?
Yeah.
And so yeah, Arneson was involved in that. He ran a lot of those. Arneson also used those in his, I mean, within the context of the Twin Cities gamers, they start with war game RPG. They go into sort of domain-based RPG where they're rulers of countries. And like Ross Maker describes them as having like campaign fever. They're addicted to the idea of the big campaign once they start doing that. And most of the time they fail for whatever reason. It's really hard to manage. And so Arneson started like one of his greatest campaigns, which is considered to be probably the largest Napoleonic campaign ever run by a referee, with just an ungodly number of players in different cities. And he started it with a Brownstein game set in Paris at the beginning of the French Revolution. And this is where David McGarry plays the princess or the queen. I forgot her name. I always forget her name, but the French queen, and which is hilarious. The Austrian queen, is it? And anyway, so they're doing that, and then at the same time as he's doing that, you know, they're doing the Brownstein games. Dwayne Jenkins creates a Brownstein, but instead of having it be just a single scenario, sort of like the RPG war game, he turns it into the campaign, and he introduces the idea of the campaign. And he does Brownstone, Texas, which is set in the Wild West, 1880s era Wild West. And they all have goofy names, and it's really campy and goofy. And they're, I mean, even there, like there's talk about like the Lost Frenchman mine, and it is possible that the Lost Frenchman mine would be considered maybe the first dungeon adventure, but it was happening in the Wild West. They were exploring an old haunted mine. in the Wild West times. So, but we don't have any evidence of that. It's just hearsay between the players. They're like, oh yeah, there was the Lost Frenchman mine.
Is it
And
possible
then,
that that's going to be another Tonisborg where the documents are going to show up one day?
I really doubt it, because I think that a lot of Jenkins stuff is just lost. Um, I don't know. I got John Peterson got me some what he had about that I used in the film, which, thanks, John. Really appreciate that. And all we have is some fragments of referee notes from one of his games. The other thing we have is a write-up that Dave Arneson did about his character El Pancho, or El Pancho, instead of Poncho, or it's Poncho, like belly,
Yeah.
and it was El Pancho, I forget, but it's a parody about Pancho Villa, but
Yeah.
it's about the big fat guy. He plays the big jolly
Paunch.
revolutionary, brigand,
Yeah.
and it's just a write-up where they would do these play reports. That was the other thing that's interesting, is they would play a game and then they would do a play report, and somebody would write up what had happened, and they would analyze the game, like, what happened that changed the outcome of this historic battle the way we played it this time. And so we have a lot of play reports. So anyway, yeah, Dwayne was running that. I suspect maybe like as early as October of 1970. Date chasing is kind of the big thing with the historians, and it's kind of like, we just know it happened and nobody else was doing that. And so that creates, so you've got the character driven game by Wesley, and then you've got this sort of campaign game by Dwayne Jenkins. They're being refereed the same way, so they're very similar. And then Arneson starts doing these Blackmoor games in the town of Blackmoor, and it starts as a sort of a medieval Brownstein type game. He even calls it that, the medieval Brownstein. And what happens though is that it's very, very strange. I mean, because of what he's trying to do, and because he's trying to do something based on fantasy, he needs to kind of step in as a referee, because there are too many unknown things that none of the players know, that he needs to guide the players through. We think it's hard to date when the first dungeon adventure happened too. But we suspect it would be maybe like 1971, like around Christmas of 1971 was when the first dungeon adventure happened. So about, where are we? I mean, maybe 9 months. Well, we don't even know when it started. Like there's all this, I think that there are a lot of people running around claiming certitude based on what they see in documents. And it's like, and every time we find a new document, it's like, well, okay, that just blew everything away.
Yeah.
And the problem is that there aren't enough professional researchers that have the experience of having studied, I don't know, like early hominids or something, where it's like, they've only been around for 3 million years. Oh, wait,
Yeah.
we found another bone and we just backdated it like 6 million years or whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the game, right? In real research. And that's, we're all amateurs. I'm not saying I'm any better. I'm an amateur researcher when it comes to games. Can't get like a ludology degree, I don't think. Maybe you can now, but I never could.
Yeah.
And so Arneson invents the dungeon adventure, which is that's the turning point in the whole thing. And that's not to say that it's any better than what Wesley was doing or what Jenkins was doing. It's just that the purpose behind the game is different, and the experience the players have is really different. So I mean, that's that whole that's where I get really like kind of pissed off about terms like proto RPG, because I think that Wesley's game is an RPG. It is just a different kind of RPG. So what Arneson creates, if you're using the idea of story models, what he creates is the adventure game, which is interesting, because I came up with that idea to call it the adventure game, and then I was like, oh yeah, that's the name of Arneson's game company. he called his company Adventure Games, and I was like, wow, he must have really understood what he was doing,
Yeah.
you know, on a higher level than most people were aware.
Was
And
it
so
just from like taking a step back, and I know your history is you started in the early days of playing Dungeons and Dragons yourself, and then
yeah,
I think you took a bit of a gap. But when you got back into it, and then you started doing the research and the documentary, was it kind of like awakening those early days for you as you were interviewing all these folks for the documentary, as far as like what the magic was for a role-playing game for you?
well, I think what it woke up is that role-playing games in their inception were difficult. Like these little rules are very incomplete in a lot of ways. Okay, and so you had to either you had somebody show you, you'd have to be taught how to play, and you'd have to see somebody playing. And every group had its own style of play. So I mean, there's well documented there are people who didn't even realize that it wasn't supposed to be played with miniatures, that they just played with miniatures and played it like a board game, like a Game of Dungeon board game or something like that. Um, and other people did other things. So there was a real culture of kind of inventiveness, very, very creative, inventive sort of thing. And that doesn't exist today in a lot of ways. And so when I met when Chris says that too, he's like, these are like the guys I hung out with. Like, these are really smart guys, and they're like really creative, and they don't need to buy, they'll buy the 3 games they want, but they're going to be like, this one has a better movement system. This one has a better combat system. I like the way the maps are done for this one. Let's just mix them up and make our own game and add our own additional rules, because we can make a better game, and so those are the kind of guys they are. I mean, and they're they're creative, and they do a lot of different things that aren't just gaming, but they bring to game, it kind of helps bring more to the gaming. So that was the main thing, was hanging out with them, was just like, oh, these are my people. I'm going to hang out with these guys, and once we got to be friends with them, I mean, we're buddies with them. It sucks that we're not in the Twin Cities, or I'd just be gaming with them. Like, they would be my game group. And and that's the other thing, is like, I think the RPG crowd, there's a lot of excitement when you first get into RPGs, and you're very focused on that. And for the Twin Cities gamers, a lot of them are into they're just like, yeah, we want to get together and play our war games, right? Because that's what we really like. And I'm sort of the same way. It's like, I'll play an RPG, but there's a certain level of risk and stress involved in a big war game that's a lot more like gambling. And I really like that feeling of just like, man, when I've got cavalry hidden in that forest, and I'm just waiting for them to come up that road, but if I let them out too soon, then they're going to get blasted, right? I've got to just time it perfectly. And so a lot of nail biting in a war game, and so, yeah, I don't know, that's just kind of what they're like, and they do the annual Blackmoor games. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, but really it was Arneson who created this other format. That's what I wanted to go back to, which I call the adventure game. And so that is what role playing is. It's very much based on, like, if you think of action movies, like even Raiders of the Lost Ark would be a great example, because it has a little dungeon in the beginning of it, right? You have a character, they're going through, they have agency to move through the story, through the physical space, and as they do so, a narrative is being developed, and so you're getting a narrative out of that, which is another thing that, like, narrative is inherent to the adventure game, and so you are creating narratives. Everything is a narrative in the game. And I think that there's a lot of people are like, well, in the old days, they just, all they did was kill monsters. And it was like, not really, because the reason you went to the dungeon was you heard that there were, like, these orcs were coming out of this place, hole in the ground. They were, like, attacking the villagers, and the villagers need help. So you got to go figure out what's going on. And then you go there and you find out, like, well, the orcs that are coming out of the hole in the ground actually work for this wizard. And he lives way down in the dungeon and is surrounded by all of his super powerful minions. And so, it starts to evolve a story, and then you encounter good people and bad people in a dungeon or in the wilderness, and those create other narratives. They're all like mini narratives.
Like the emergent narrative is what happens as you play the game, the interaction between the world and the players and the referee.
I wouldn't even say it's an emergent narrative. I think it's just you're in a narrative state when you play these games, and like just different narratives. You're going to get narrative. The whole thing is narrative. Don't even, don't lie to yourself. You're in a narrative state. So Arneson, I just wanted to add one thing. It's kind of fascinating because there was a lot of conjecture that Arneson's first dungeon game wasn't even a true role-playing game. It's not like Dungeons and Dragons. It's a proto RPG, and it's like, no, he had two groups, and he was running the bad guys against the good guys. So I think it was Kurt Cry and Sukup that were the Balrog and the wizard that were down in the dungeon that had stolen something from the Baron, and the players were going down. And so it was like he was running a split party in a D&D game where each party is taking turns with him and playing. And I imagine that Sukup and the Balrog and the wizard were down there, and they were just getting reports of like, oh, somebody's attacked a group of orcs over here, in the dungeon. What do you want to do? It's like, and they're like, okay, we should send some, 10 more orcs to that area or whatever. And so for them, their experience was a very fog of war thing. And I'm sure Arneson was creating fake attacks. Like maybe it was just a monster that, a spider or something that attacked their men or orcs or whatever. But he was creating this thing where they're trying to be commanders in a like a double blind game. But then for the adventurers at the same time, since they're moving and they're the raiders, he was creating a true RPG type adventure game experience of the reality of the fantasy RPG. But he was, it's the first time that anybody's ever done a dungeon game, and he's running essentially a split party simultaneously. Absolutely crazy. Like the guy was just, that's to me, that's just amazing. And later on, he was known, like if you talk to Jeff Barry describes Dave Arneson as the Lord of Chaos. And he's like, if you got 8 people in the party, he's going to have a different story for every character. And he's like, he's been doing it so long, he invented it. He's totally at home. You can go off anywhere you want. He'll run a split party with 8 characters and be totally on top of it, which is something that most dungeon masters would, it's terrifying. Even splitting it in half is terrifying. Anyway,
the old adage of never splitting a party, right? Which the payout or the payoff at the end when you can make it work is amazing if you can make it work, right? So let's try to connect the dots here. So you've done the documentary, you've interviewed all these amazing foundational people to role-playing games. They've mentioned the Tonisborg dungeon. So how does that play into the new book, The Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, that you put out? And how did you pull it all together? What was the formation of that idea?
It took about 2.5 years to write the book. It's sort of just evolved.
Well, just tell us how did the Tonisborg get discovered? Because that's kind of the missing piece we haven't talked about yet. Is like people mentioned it in the documentary, and then what?
Right. Well, actually, they mentioned it in one interview, and what we would do is we would do these casual interviews at David McGarry's house. We would have dinner, or we'd order in food or something. And I was always trying to get Rose to come in, and she would come in and do the interviews. She'd be hiding in the kitchen. She didn't want to be on camera. But Rose, I got to get you in for an interview. But anyway, so it would be like me and Ross and it'd be our crew. So you had Ryan, our assistant, who would often run the camera during those, and Chris, camera and cinematographer guy, and then me interviewing, and then Ross and Wesley and McGarry together, and we did that with a lot of the interviews. I try to get people in pairs because sometimes they like jostle each other's memory, And so we would just do these really casual interviews where I would let about half of it just be a meandering discussion about whatever. I'd guide them a little bit into the past because I want to know about them and who they are. But I also just want to know, I mean, there is a magical thing to see these people who have known each other since they were, some of them since they were about 16 years old or younger. Just watch them interact. Like for instance, when Bill Hoyt is with Dwayne Jenkins, I mean, that's just a funny scene to me because those guys have known each other since grade school and they're like, oh, 70 years old or something. So you're looking at these two, like he's like Bill refers to Jenkins as Jenks. Jenks, I mean, it's just you see this feeling of love toward friends, this yeah, it's just beautiful. You see that you can't say that. You just watch it and you're like, oh wow, these guys are tight, they know each other. They've been through all the BS and they're just like having a good time still, And so we do that with all the groups, but with the I'm going around, I know I deviate all over the place, but with the Wesley Maker McGarry interviews, they would talk about all kinds of things. Like the one person, we started the movie about a year before after Dan Nicholson passed away. And Dan Nicholson is an incredibly significant person in the group as far as I'm concerned. And he's not, he's an unsung hero. It's sort of like, what is it, Don Kay in Lake Geneva. Okay, that's Gary Gygax's best friend. We know almost nothing about him. We have almost no photographs. I mean, we like as a collective historical community, I only know of like maybe 3 or 4 photographs of Don Kay, right? But he is part of the G&K enterprises that launched Dungeons and Dragons, and he was the one who put them, like he was the one that laid it on the line and said, this is worth doing. I'm going to take out, a couple $1,000 or whatever it was so that we can launch this game and make it happen. And yeah, and he's unknown. And Dan Nicholson is kind of the same sort of person. It's like, yeah, he wasn't maybe the biggest driving force, but he was there the whole time. So yeah, so I just let him go off on these things. Sorry, I go on tangents. And McGarry would always do these things, like he'd be like, oh, well, in this night, I mean, it's like, oh, I have this old dungeon. Like, you do? I'm like, yeah, let me go get it, So he just kind of like leaves the table and we're like, oh, okay, we'll just keep talking about whatever we're talking about. And then he shows up and he's like, here, I get this dungeon. And so we looked at it. We didn't look at it for very long. I wanted to look at it longer, but it's like, we're doing an interview. We can't just have cameras rolling and just be looking at maps together, right? But everybody looked at it. My prognosis was that it was a Dave Arneson dungeon because it looks exactly like a Blackmoor dungeon. People don't, I mean, there are like all these little significant things that the research people are aware of, and they'll look at something and be able to, like, how the dungeon is drawn is a huge indicator of who made it.
It's like handwriting. Like you can tell how somebody designs a dungeon just based upon their personality almost.
Well, like I wrote an article for there's the Journal of Mazes and Catacombs or something like that, Karadraya. And I wrote an article for them. I mean, it's like kind of a scientific journal about mazes, and I forgot what the rest of the title was. But I wrote an article for them just about dungeon map symbolism for doors. And so that was one of the key things that I saw in that map, was that I refer to the Dave Arneson door drawing style as the ping pong paddle, because instead of, if you look at, well, there are like so many different door drawings, the way people draw maps. There's the original one in, I believe it's the monster or wilderness, underworld and wilderness. This one, yeah. This one has just little parallel lines. I mean, you can't see that because it's so tiny, but this one has, basically you have a line and you have 2 parallel lines drawn across it. And so that represents the doorway gap, right? With a door in it. Later, they went to one which I have deduced probably is devised off of, like, this is where McGarry's dungeon game is such a huge influence on D&D, and people don't even realize it because it doesn't look like a role-playing game. Nobody's looking at it to see where it's influencing. D&D, and again, it's like, oh no, the door style that you see in most of the TSR modules, which is the thick lines with the little rectangle,
Yeah.
right? That is lifted right off of McGarry's prototype for Dungeon board game, because that's the way he did them on Dungeon board game. And so they started imitating. If they had, Gary Gygax had the prototype for a while, and so he was just imitating what he saw there. And then Arneson did the thing where it was just a gap, but then he would have the ping pong paddle for the doorway.
Yeah.
So Arneson is interesting because he's the only one that shows you which way the door swings. Well, there's another kind of door diagram. It's more like an architectural diagram type doorway. But Arneson's kind of the first one that shows you, okay, you come to the door and it opens inward or outward. So yeah, I saw those maps, and that was kind of like a huge indicator, like, okay, this is an Arneson map, you know. And then you look at the corridors, and it's just this maze of diagonal corridors that players are going to get lost in and just die, you know. And that's what happened with a lot of characters. They would go down into Tonisborg. It doesn't look that big, but once you're down on the 8th level and you got to figure your way out of there, it's a mess, you know. And
the one thing that jumped out at me was, as you mentioned, the diagonal design of it. And for me, like, I mean, you grow up and you get the hex paper, or not the hex paper, the grid paper, and you're drawing your dungeon and you just go on the lines. But they never did, or at least these, for the most part, some of the diagonals. And I creatively, they look awesome. I like the
yeah, I mean, you know, actually, you know, we get complaints. People are saying the book's too expensive, so we're looking at maybe doing an even cheaper version that's just on like really crappy print on demand paper. That's like, I mean, it's like, it's not like we don't want people to have the dungeon, right?
Yeah.
We don't want people to have the book, so we're going even cheaper. But I mean, here's a double spread of maps. I don't know if it's very in focus. Everything is out of focus because my glasses aren't on.
It's all viewable. Yeah. And I can,
I guess it would be this way maybe.
And I can insert the PDF, I think, of the map on there too. So
anyway, yeah, you see how diagonal all of that is. That's another significant thing that we've gotten from Tonisborg, is that when we were talking about it, the other thing the guys noticed is there's one room on the dungeon keys, I don't remember what level it would be, like maybe 3 or 4, where there are knolls. Here's level 6. I mean, all the monsters are very much OD&D type monsters, because it was a draft of Dungeons and Dragons, so the monsters are all there. Even the Black Puddings are in there, which is Dave Arneson's first, like, it's the first like not fictional or not fantasy monster. It's a science fiction monster being imported into a fantasy game. Anyway, there's like a lot of you'll see the similarity if you know original Dungeons and Dragons and you see these maps, you'll be like, oh, this is just straight up OD&D. Oh yeah, room number 10 on the 4th level has gnolls in it, and there are were-rats there too. So those are very unique to D&D. I mean, the Black Pudding too, you know, the Black Pudding is the most D&D-ish thing in there. I'm trying to think, or no, it's even level 2. There are gnolls in one room, the treasure map room. Yeah. Anyway, so when the guys saw that, I think it was Ross and Wesley that were like, well, there are gnolls in here, so this cannot predate the publication of D&D. We were just busy, but McGarry mentioned that it was probably like in further conversations, he was like, I think what it is a set of maps from Tonisborg. And so, I mean, this is where we come full circle. I'm talking in circles. The research community was aware of Tonisborg because it's mentioned in a couple places, I think. The most significant mention is that I believe Arneson says that the first person that was a dungeon master for him so that he could play was Greg Svenson running Tonisborg Dungeon. So that makes, and that's another thing, is like Greg Svenson probably was the second dungeon master ever, like an RPG referee for fantasy game. Before that, because he talks about some things he did because Arneson was tired that day, so Arneson just handed him some notes and said, go run these guys doing this thing. So Greg is like a really significant person in the history of the game because he's probably the second person to ever referee a fantasy game like this. And he makes what is probably maybe it's the second mega dungeon out of the Twin Cities. Arneson had the Blackmoor dungeon, which originally was only 6 levels, and then it gets bigger. And then he also did a little one at I think the Temple of Id, or I think it's called, which is a little bit outside of Blackmoor town. And then he did other ones, but later. But it's also significant because the way that it was designed. Unfortunately, Greg doesn't have the notes from when he made it, but Arneson had a system for creating dungeons randomly, and so he gave Greg, kind of gave him, this is how you do it. I mean, it was probably a very simple system. You just a stairway down to start it, and then you go.
And I think I read in the notes it was all like rolling like D6s, and there's a mechanism involved with auto creation of the dungeon, but the mechanism itself almost implied the design. So it wasn't completely random. There was like some thought behind what the mechanism was meant to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of a, I mean, I don't know, there's been a lot of talk about that aspect of it, is that it's not fully randomized, but it is sort of randomized. I've been looking at it, and I mean, I can deduce that from I've been looking at the maps for, I've probably looked at them more than anybody on the planet at this point, because I've been running the dungeon for years now, since we found it, which might have been 4 years ago. I don't know. You figure McGarry and Greg ran it, but I don't even know if they spent that much time really, it was just a thing they were doing. So they didn't spend as much time analyzing it and looking for the properties within it. Whereas I've been just looking at it for years and sort of thinking about, what am I seeing here, And so yeah, that's kind of the interesting thing. Like, what level did we give out as a sample? Was it level 3?
I can't recall. Unfortunately, I don't have it handy, but
okay. No, I just wondered if you had it handy, because you could open
I guess
it,
for viewers
discuss it.
Maybe I'll just insert at this point. We can continue on, but I'll insert at this point. So you are doing a Kickstarter for the Tonisborg book, which includes this dungeon, and there's a free, I think, 11-page PDF that people can go check it out. The Kickstarter will be in the description, the links and everything like that, and people can go check it out and just get a sense of a little bit about the dungeon, Tonisborg. And the other thing I want to talk about, we don't have to get there yet, is like your piece of it as far as the DM advice. So we've got the dungeon that you discovered, and then how does that translate into envisioning the product, which also includes a lot of really good DM advice and kind of theory on how to play ODT.
This would be good to insert earlier on, please. And then I can do the description of what it is.
Well, we're gonna run it right through, so we're good. No editing. I don't like to edit. We'll just
okay. Well, I mean, we just hit on a lot of things, and I lost where I was. Well, let me just talk about the maps. I mean, I think the maps are. So I'm kind of slow because it's earlier in the day. That's why I was like, when you said we're gonna do this show at 9 a.m., I'm like, I am in the first gear at that point, and I'm not going to be very cohesive. But the insignificant thing is that Dave Arneson gave Greg a system for doing a random dungeon or a semi-random dungeon, and it looks exactly like Blackmoor dungeon. Not exactly like it, but stylistically, it's very similar. So that's like, okay, so is Blackmoor dungeon sort of procedurally created through die rolls, or at least parts of it? And so that's significant, because all these things kind of right when D&D is being created is right when computers are starting to really get to be something, and so the idea of procedural things in games is interesting, because they're doing, when they're creating their games, what they're doing is they're sort of writing pseudocode, like program pseudocode on paper, so they can control games, and that's what their rules are, is this sort of weird pseudocode. And And so there are dungeon games that appear within a year of D&D being published. Dungeon games appear on computers. I was there in the place where that happened, actually, as a kid in '75, and played the original dungeons. So yeah, so that's kind of interesting that they're doing that, because they're sort of doing, you see that now with games where they'll have like sort of a recursive element within the game where it can just create an endless world for you, and you don't know that it's an endless fate. It just generates interest for you, and you go on forever, right?
Yeah.
And so they were doing this on paper. Arneson was doing this on paper in as early as '71. That's pretty phenomenal, really. But you were asking about other things, like how the dungeon, we found the dungeon from the McGarry meeting. It was Dan Boggs who reached out to Greg and said, here's some scans of this thing we found. And finally, and just showed them to him. And I don't know why I hadn't done that, because when I interviewed Greg, I even told Greg, I was like, I think we found your dungeon. He was like, oh, cool,
Yeah.
But so Dan gets credit for like making, verifying it. I mean, I'm not trying to undermine that, but I'm mostly giving myself credit for being a moron, which is, that's kind of my attitude with, like, Chris and I joke about the fact that we completed our movie out of like 4 film companies that were going to do D&D movies. We were the only ones that could do it and complete it. And it's because we're just too stupid to know any better, is what we always tell people. But onto the Tonisborg book. It's interesting because there's a different culture in gaming, and this started even as early as the late '70s in D&D. People started getting really obsessed with modules and seeing and running prefabricated things. They were a lot less turnkey back then, so you would get a lot of, like, even Judges Guild would publish dungeons, and they looked like the Tonisborg keys. It would literally be a map, a bunch of numbers, and by each number it'd be like 8 orcs and 300 gold pieces. And so as a DM, if you got that dungeon and you were going to run it, you had to go like, okay, what are these orcs doing? Why are they there? And kind of you'd have to create a narrative to understand their motives for what they were doing. Maybe these orcs are just going to run away if they feel overrun by a big party of 10 players or whatever. And so, but it was very much like that. And so now, of course, the dungeons are very much very turnkey, like even down to like what people say, like the dungeon masters are reading like scripts, and that's just absurd to me, because I think that the nature of the game is that it is a constantly evolving, it is a new thing. And that's kind of like the old, I'm kind of meandering. It all ties in together with the idea of like what the OSR is. And I don't like the idea of the OSR. I like the idea of playing in the old way, right? But then to say that we're playing in the old way kind of just makes it seem like it's this really fixed, it's very concretized, and you can't do anything else. And so really the old way it's more about methods rather than fixed rules. And so when Dan and I wanted to write the book, originally I wanted to do a book. I suggested we call it 1001 Passages, and do a parody, not a parody, but sort of parallel to the chess books by what was the guy's name? Something like Reinfeld or something. He did these chess problem books. It was like 1001, traps, and another one was like 1001 checkmates. And they were the books that chess players would just pour over to practice, just like basic tactics, and just sort of ways to learning to visualize really inside, like convoluted patterns. So I thought it'd be fun to do like a book about playing RPGs that's, just gives you like all these examples of how to handle different situations. And it wasn't necessarily like, it's not a rule, it's not a guide. It's not fixed like these really turnkey things. It was more like, here are some ideas, and just read these ideas, and maybe you can springboard off those and create your own ideas. So it was more like 1001 passages. So it'd just be a room description or a hallway description, just a million different encounter ideas of what you can do. And Dan just said, like, let's just do Tonisborg. And I was like, okay, excellent. We're going to do Tonisborg. And so we ported that idea. That was the idea of teaching people methods for playing in the old way, but there are new ideas in the whole section. It's not about being bound by any sort of specific set of rules that you have to follow. It's more about understanding that there is a method and sort of a mindset that you can get into, and when you're playing in that way, you're playing. It's a different style than what you see in newer games. And I hate, if you're playing 5e and you love 5e, play your 5e. I don't care. Okay. The difference would be like for example, somebody on the internet, we were joking, and he said, yeah, I had a young player run into a problem. There was a situation, and in order to get further with whatever the thing was, you had to solve a puzzle. And so the character was like, what do I need to roll to know how to solve the puzzle? And the dungeon master was like, keep rolling those dice, and I'm going to get a drink. And then when I get back, nothing will have changed, because you don't get to roll dice to solve this problem. You have to figure it out on your own, and so that's the difference, is like all these lore rolls and, rolls to know what you don't know. And that is just like video game on paper. And that's part of the problem, is that a lot of the designers that are designing RPGs now for the big companies are coming out of the video game industry. So they're gamifying everything like a computer program. And that is not what was intended in the role-playing game at all. I actually, if you go to the Kickstarter, I just got a hair up my ass to talk about. I had this idea. And so I did this whole write-up about the idea of formal and informal game structure, and how really unique the role-playing game that Arneson created is, because it combines formal and informal in one game. But the informal part, which is the make-believe part, is the skeleton upon which all the rules hang, right? And so it's really weird, because it's just an amorphous thing. And so when you need a rule, it's very much like a precursor to, I always say this, it's like a precursor to object-oriented programming. You don't, you're going along and you're doing whatever you're doing in the dungeon, and it's like, well, as you walk over this one part of the passage, I need everybody to roll me a die, and everybody rolls a die, and it's like, okay, so-and-so gets a poison dart in their leg because it comes out of this little hole in the hallway, and what was I going to say about that? But that rule only happens. It's only going to happen when you need to resolve this particular situation, or you go to another place and you find a door. I want to open the door. I want to listen to the door. This now requires a rule, a judgment call. But instead of having these are situations where if the referee would say like, oh, you don't hear anything, and then you open the door and it's like, there's a dragon there, right? The players are going to be like, okay, you're a jerk and I don't want to play with you. But if you take a die roll and you just treat it as a die roll, now the referee is sort of out of the loop, as far as he doesn't get any blame, she. And so you have this system where you're using this make-believe mechanism to control everything, and then you're applying rules, and that's what I call. In a book we call it traditional role playing. I don't know. It's trying to find, like, traditional sounds kind of stuffy too, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
it comes with connotations of like, we don't want to change type of element to it, but the traditional style. And one of the things about your update that I liked, and I think it was in your update, maybe I read it somewhere else, that you talked about there, over time, people have always tried to kind of reinvent improve upon the original concept.
Yeah. That's that one. Yeah.
So maybe this would be a good opportunity for you to talk about that specific instance of people come in and they go, well, I don't like this, I'm going to fix it. And they add more rules in order to fix it. But
that's the thing, is like, that's what I was trying to, I would think that everybody has a personal, what I call the personal sweet spot on what the balance is between the informal, which is all the make-believe, and the interchange between the DM and the players that creates the experience and the immersion, and the formal, which is the rules. And people have desires for different degrees of that, because they want to have more control or less control, or I don't know. It depends on what your goal is. And but I do think that ever since D&D was created, there was this sort of like, oh, that's not realistic. We need to do this, right? And so I was on the internet. I think it was RPG Pub. I went there to advertise Tonisborg, and there was a discussion about realism in combat, and that's the classic one where it's like, no, you do not. If you really want to play the game properly, you do not want realism in combat. You want abstraction in combat, and you're not aiming to simulate what happens during a combat. You're only aiming for results of what happens from a combat. And it's a very different thing. And recently I read, I mean, it's so frustrating because people will post things they find, and a lot of Gary Gygax quotes. And I love a lot of the stuff that he says about the RPG. And there was one, and they posted this page from something, and he was talking about something else. But right below it, he starts talking about combat and the fact that combat is intended as an abstraction, that your hit points are not real damage points; they're a wearing down, and that we don't want to get so granular that like when you're fighting, you know, your foot gets cut off or something in a battle. It's like we still want to stay within sort of that silly realm of like maybe an Errol Flynn movie where you just, you know, and you know, like you get a slash, but you know, you fight on and you don't think too much about what you're doing to the bad guys with your sword. You're not thinking about like hacking off limbs and heads and ears and stuff, because that's kind of gross. You're vanquishing your foes, right? But from a mechanical standpoint, like Gygax I was just like astounded. I was like, oh, this is where I am with it, you know, like I think this is important. He just reiterated everything I was thinking. I was like, okay, well, that's great, because I mean, I thought I was being a genius because I had come up on this idea of thinking in terms of abstraction. It's like, oh no, Gary had, you know, both Gary and Dave both were thinking that way. Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, there's just this obsession with wanting to put on detail. The thing is that these games come out of war games, and so what you're seeing is the removal of that. I mean, it's even within the Blackmoor bunch. Okay, they're taking a strict war game. They were playing a very strict traditional miniatures war game. They find Tonisborg. They find not Tonisborg. They find Totten. All these Totten, and they realize they find a couple passages in there that suggest this idea of how to simulate the fog of war. Most significant being Totten's statement that Wesley paraphrases, and Arneson also paraphrases in one of his books, the idea that a player should be allowed to do anything they want, although not always successfully, but you're allowed to try to do the thing. And so they move toward this. They have this trajectory where they're going further and further away from an actual board game, to the point where Arneson just removes the board game. When you're in a dungeon, you have a map, but you don't have a board game. You're not moving pieces on a board. And then McGarry sees Arneson's game, and he's like, you know, that would make a great board game. And so he takes this whole like 10-year trajectory and turns it around and turns it into a board game, right? And so they already did that within their group. And so when I see, it's just, you know, every time I see somebody trying to do the realism thing, it's like, well, we need a map, we need miniatures, we need this, we need that, we need more complexity. And actually, the more complexity you add to the game, the less the realistic the experience is. What the goal of the game is to experience this whatever you're doing in whatever setting or whatever. It's not to simulate the thing in sort of a, I don't know, just in a really detailed way, like a game of Panzer Blitz or something.
How much do you think of that is because of the money making? Like when you think about even modules, or like, okay, now we got to sell miniatures, and now we want to, all those things over the years, like how much of it is driven by just pure economic, like we made a game, but once they buy it, they don't need us anymore, so let's make other products to fit.
Right, a lot of it is economic like that. I mean, that's the thing with like even the Tonisborg book. We were just like, we're just going to put everything in there. See, that's another bit. I didn't put it in the movie. I was saving it for a follow-up movie. Then we went broke, so we made a movie, but then we don't have any money to make another movie yet. But we have like tons of footage, and we want to shoot more footage. But she was holding these up, and in her interview, and she would always be best when she thought we'd turned off the camera, when she thought we were done. And she just started just to kind of ruminate. She was like, yeah, it was so, so simple back in the day. You just had these little books. And she had an original brown box set. I'm like, oh yeah, you're holding about $10,000 worth of game in your hands. But she was just like, it's just so simple, and she was talking about, I think her son Brian, like when Brian goes to game, he's got so many books that he's got to carry with him, and I think her son was playing maybe, whatever edition of D&D was out then. But she was like, yeah, back then it was just, your imagination. You just had these little books and it was so much fun. And I mean, it says like Gail is kind of like the I want to listen before I start the follow-up film, whenever we get to that. I just want to go through her interviews and be like, okay, Gail is going to open the movie and she's going to close the movie. She's the only one who understands what's going on here. And because she's not looking at it from this sort of dorky wargamer perspective. She's just like, how do we enjoy ourselves playing this game? Like we don't need a lot of this, and she's got like an 8th level cleric character that in black to get to 8th level in Blackmoor is just amazing, like because Arneson is known for being just like he is the killer DM. He would just wade through parties and destroy them ruthlessly. But yeah, back to go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so, there's the economic forces that are at play. And then I think some of the frustration and why there's like such discourse often between like, say, OSR, and I know we don't want to call it OSR, but the old way of playing versus some of the newer, like realistic kind of mechanics that take away from the immersion. But the frustration is like the older players go, this is what you're missing out on, to the newer players that might not have discovered it because they're so entrenched in 5e or whatever. I don't want to throw 5e under the bus, but like that we say to them like, hey, this is a huge opportunity for immersion. You should try it, but then they don't because
right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I mean, it's designed for addiction. The game is designed for addiction. It's as much designed for addiction as the social media platforms are. They're not doing you a favor. You think, oh, I get to talk to my friends. Like, no, you get a lot of other crap in there too. And so the algorithms that are built into social media, which would be computer algorithms, those algorithms are built into the paper code of the RPG that make it addictive. So the one thing they wanted to do that we didn't have in the past was to allow players to play solo. And what I mean by this is that they made character creation become a really important part of the game. So everybody goes home and they work on their character and they're all sort of competing to make the cool character, right? And so they spend hours on that, and you need to get all the books to get all the classes and all the stuff, right? But the main thing is just this addiction mechanism, because you're getting like, your little brain drugs are flying in there. Actually, I wrote that on my blog. I talked about how like toxic RPGs are, and not in and it's like I say that, but what I mean is like you have to be aware of what this is doing to you, and that there are like impulse control is just a level of maturity that you have to evolve. Like women tend to have a stronger sense of impulse control than men, or boys and girls. Not saying everybody, they're going to be outliers, but as a generality. There's that within gender, Oh, I'm going to get into trouble. Let's not talk about gender. People have issues. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, it's everywhere in these games, it's there is this addictive trait to it. I mean, even chess, I know chess players, I was a pretty hardcore chess addict, and chess is like incredibly addictive. And I just had to quit cold turkey, because I was like, I'm not doing anything in my life. Like, I get on the bus to go to work and I'm looking at a chess book and I'm visualizing the board and I'm turning it in my head and moving pieces and rotating it and moving a piece, and and so I do that on the bus. I get to work because I have a job where I don't have to be, I'm a control room operator. I'm sort of screwing off because I'm looking at my chess book the whole night. I was doing, so it was like, my waking hours are full of chess. I look at my daughter and I just see this, like, you know, if she says, Dad, I'm hungry, I'm like thinking of it as this weird abstract chess thing, you know. Yeah, I just had to give it up, you know. So, but you can build that into that sort of addiction into anything. Nobody seems to be talking about it very much. But so I do find it interesting that you brought it up, because I don't think anybody else has asked me about that before, the addiction factor. But now let's get the young players. I think that there's the level of consumerism is different. I mean, consumerism has always been there. We were buying consumer goods when we were kids. The thing is that the market wasn't as heavily dominated by TSR as it is now by Wizards of the Coast. You could have these little startup companies, you know, like not Flying Buffalo, but Metagaming. I don't know what their first thing was. I think maybe they were doing online computer games. But their first micro game was Ogre.
Yeah.
And those showed up in the game shop along with all the other, along with D&D and all the Judges Guild stuff. And the minute those showed up,
I just interviewed Steve Jackson, I guess about a month ago, and he talked about the metagaming and the transition of how like he came in afterwards with Ogre, and then eventually went on to like start his own gaming company. And it was just kind of interesting to kind of see his evolution and how in parallel to a lot of these things that you're discussing as far as like the commerce side.
Well, like, yeah, I was actually, I mean, you could, if you wanted to talk about the idea of like the sort of the really concretized game as opposed to the really formalized game as opposed to the informal game, like Steve Jackson's Melee and Wizard are a good example of like taking the combat from a fantasy game and turning it into a war game again.
Yeah.
And I just, we're talking about so many big things that it's like getting there is a little bit hard. So maybe I should shut up about whatever I was talking about. What I was going to say was simply that in the old days, people were into a lot of different kinds of games. And it wasn't just like, I am only a role player. I am also a war gamer. Oh, maybe we'll get the miniatures out and play a miniatures war game. So within my group of gamers anyway, I sort of abandoned a group of fanboy RPGers because they never wanted to do anything but play AD&D. And I was like, you know what? I want to play other games. I got a collection, you know, thousands of dollars of games, and half of them haven't even been opened and the counters punched out. And I sat that way for, 40 years. But so there's a big difference in the kind of gamers my group and the people like me were, which is when you described earlier on, what was it like meeting the Blackmoor bunch? It was like, these are my kind of gamers, because they'll play an RPG, but then they'll also be like, let's get out 1,000 Napoleonic miniatures and put them on a giant table and play for 8 hours over 2 days,
Yeah. And I'm kind of the same way, where like I just love just playing games in general, and it's probably an unpopular opinion, but fantasy, like typical like D&D fantasy, I kind of get tired of. And so I'm always looking for these like weird oddball games. And those are, even when I was younger, those are the things that always fueled me. I found like new rule sets and like new like settings and that kind of stuff. I just found it fascinating. So for me, whenever I find out somebody only plays 5e, I go, whoa, you're missing out on such a diverse.
See, that's the thing. It's not like your game sucks. I mean, the people do that, like your game sucks because this and that and the other thing. And the suckage that I see is the stuff that, when you were talking about addictive properties, they've created this game that has certain addictive properties that appeal to a certain age group. So yeah, I mean, that's there, but I was going to go on to something else and now I lost the thread. I usually keep a pen and I write on my hand as I'm doing an interview, because I'll want to come back to something later. But
one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I hope you don't mind me going down this rabbit hole, is when you talked about games and GM-less games versus having a referee. And it's been in the back of my mind for quite a while now that I think, referees or DMs, GMs have kind of been thrown under the bus over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years.
It's part of the evolution of the product as like a turnkey product, and it doesn't serve the gamers. What it serves is the corporation, And I mean, I make no bones about the fact that I hope Wizards of the Coast burns to the ground at some point here. Like, I'm just like, I don't need you guys. I've got these, right? I bought these. And see, this is what I was wanted to say about the traditional role playing, or whatever we call this, the informal role playing, maybe, is that it's always evolving. It's not an old style. It's a condition that you're in when you're playing that kind of game, and it is always evolving and it's always fresh. And so in Tonisborg, a lot of people were like, oh, it's just like old school stuff. And it's like, there's stuff I invented like 2 years ago that I had never seen before. Like the magic finger lock trap. That was something I invented for a sci-fi game, and then I used it in a fantasy game. And so that's kind of a cool thing. And it's nowhere in Tonisborg, but it's like, you can put this in Tonisborg and you can upgrade your Tonisborg. And that's the other thing about the modular thing. Like, this is not a module, this wing product pitch. It's not a module in the traditional terms, or not even true. Well, yeah, since the 70s, when they started making modules, people wanted the pre-programmed thing. It is more like the original rules, which is a guidebook. And so we give you examples of things to spark you toward being in that mode of, I'm not using the rules, I'm using reasonable expectations, creating reasonable results, or it's an inverted equation, one or the other. It's like it's like an algebraic equation. You can put it on either side. But if you're playing under the assumption that everybody understands what reality is, or the reality that's been created is, then everybody has an understanding of what their expectations can be within that reality, story reality. And so there are places where the referee can simply just say, it is reasonable for this to happen under these circumstances. So when you do that, this is the result you get. And we don't need to roll any dice. I mean, as long as it's not like a life or death situation, like a combat or a trap, the referee just carries the story forward. And that was like maybe I wrote that in that write-up, the Pathfinder game I was in, where suddenly the iPads come out. Oh no, I was talking to people about, a lot of people want PDFs of the book. And I'm really against the idea of PDFs, because the whole book is about going back to, excuse me, traditional role-playing methods, right? So we're going to use books, and we're going to use real dice, and we're going to have pencils, and we're going to have pieces of paper. We have a character sheet in there, and people are really into character sheets, but whenever like my game group, you get a piece of paper and you write your stats down one side, and then you figure out where you want to write your equipment, and then you write some other notes somewhere else, and it's just a jumbled mess. And that's the way we played, right? And so we still play that way. So the whole book is about getting back to this really seat of your pants. We don't need to buy the commercial product of the character sheet. We don't need the official D&D pencil from Wizards of the Coast, right? Our dice come from Game Science. If you're into dice, you get Game Science dice. I'm a big Game Science fan. So now you want to get it on a PDF, and you want to bring your iPad to the game session, and you want to run the game off of your iPad. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like you've totally lost the thread here. This is about, the method of delivery of the product is also the method that you're going to deliver the thing to your players. So I don't know. I mean, it's like, I could go on and on about that. It's weird because I created this discussion, and I tried to explain my perspective, and I probably didn't do it very well. But I was like, I'm an artist, okay? I'm a writer, okay? So as a writer, I'm a kind of artist. As the artist, this is like, I've decided to work in oils, okay? No, we want you to do the Mona Lisa in charcoal. It's like, no, I want to do it in oils, and this is how you get it. You don't get it as a PDF, because I don't do PDF, not for my games. And so maybe I come off like a really arrogant snob. It's like, oh, but all these people in Europe that want your thing and whatever. And it's like, well, if they want a hard copy of anything, it's going to cost them more, And this is a singular book. You're not going to there. I haven't seen anything else that looks this good. Okay. Like, look at that,
Well, and really... I was going to ask you about that. I saw I'm Canadian. I saw that you advertised it's Canadian paper that you're using and printed in Denver. And
it's made out of Canadians, actually. It's kind of politically incorrect, but we actually use Canadians to make the paper. Anyway, go on.
Well, we make the best paper.
Bad joke. Yeah. No, you make the best paper, apparently, or the cheapest. I don't know. You make good paper. It's high quality paper. It's not garbage. It's acid free archival paper. Go on.
I was curious about your the business side of things when you went into this Kickstarter, and probably I've kept you over time here, so maybe we can talk about your Kickstarter a little bit. So you can your Kickstarter, you can get a soft cover.
Well, that's funny because we're doing this. This is this is the handbound. The inside of the book. These, except for the purple sheets that are here, these guys. Actually, they look kind of blue in this light. It's the daylight. It's the daylight balance. Anyway, everything that's inside of it gets done by a printer, and the printer goes and sends boxes of these books to the binders. The binders take these pages that are bigger than the pages, and they chop off the excess, and they put it into they glue it together into this. It's what's it called? Perfect binding is kind of the thing now. It's a glued binding. We debated whether doing hand sewing, because we've got a company that can do that. I might have a couple copies hand sewn for myself, so I have like some beautiful museum gray, the sort of things. Anyway, so the bindery then takes a metal plate. There's actually a metal plate that they use, that they stamp each. I don't know if they bind it first and then stamp it, or if they stamp it and then glue it. I don't know what the process is there. I would think maybe after, but they bind it by hand, and there's like 3 people that work there. It's not like we can just shove these through the machine like you do with all the print on demand. So once the orders are in, it, where your order came in, we try to do them by first come, first serve. You'll get your book, but it depends on when the people at the factory can actually make your book, because it takes a while to make them. But yeah, then this thing with gold foil goes boop and puts this beautiful final piece on.
On the Kickstarter, the tiers are, you can get a soft cover book and then a hardcover.
Yeah, I was going to get to that.
Yeah, okay.
So we have this hardbound, which has this outer piece. The printer also makes the exact same inner part and just puts a paper cover on it, like a card cover. So that's the soft cover version. People have been, it's not like we don't want to sell you books, right? Like the PDF thing, people were like, the book's too expensive. Can't you sell it to me for $10? It's like, I don't know, like, really? I just want to make pretty books. I'd rather not. Oops, there goes the camera. I'd rather not make really. I'd rather not do any like for me personally. When Chris was like, "We're going to do soft cover books," I was just like, "Those are a lot of F words coming out that you can't hear," and because I didn't really want to do anything but hardbound, because that's what I like. But then I saw this one, which we're thinking of doing. Like, by the time your show comes out, we might have announced it. I might be pre-announcing it.
We got a scoop
about this. Yeah, the scoop. And this is the difference is that this would be like a much lighter grade of paper, like a 50-pound. And like, if you look at it, like, see what it's doing there. That's because I was testing it. So this is my personal test copy, test print, and I was doing this to it, and I was like throwing it down on the ground. I wanted to see what it can do, but it's got like little it came with little dings on the edges. When I open it, like, if you like, here, I'm just gonna jack it up a little bit, but see, if you put your fingernail into it, you get like these. I don't know if you can see that, but they get the paper stretches basically. This is where I add patrimony, because it's like I take my fingernail and I write griff. You can't see it, but it'll be imprinted there. And so somebody will have this copy and be like, that's the griff copy. So yeah, so we're looking at doing a really low end version for anybody that wants to have this, you know. I'm really against the whole PDF thing. I just don't like it. And I know a lot of people are really into it. And I think that people need to like respect my artistic boundaries on how I want to deliver what I'm doing. Like I used to do a lot, you know, I used to do a lot of experimental video art, and it was done on TV sets. And I've been thinking of getting back into like what is it, 480 by 640 or
640 by 480.
Yeah, 640 by 480, whatever. Yeah. I've been thinking of going back to that and finding some old TVs and doing some video pieces and being really like specific about like, you can only watch this through glass, right? We're not going to project, we will never project these videos. They will only be seen through glass. And the reason is that it's like a different medium than a projector, right? To me, it's a different experience when you look at glass than when you look at a projection or you look at a plasma screen. Plasma screens are very flat and I mean, they're kind of fancy, but you lose certain elements. It's like the difference of like the kind of paper you print a photograph on. So I could go on and on about.
Well, ultimately, it comes down to the experience you want to create for somebody. And as an example, like in some, like I'm kind of like you, I like old style stuff, but at the same time, I like some of the new technologies that can create a more immersive experience. Like, you know, for example, a mothership adventure that has like the SOS thing that you can play on your iPad. It immediately puts people in the mood for the adventure at the beginning. And so there's elements of that. So I'm not beholden to just doing certain things, but in this case, I can totally see why you'd want that very tangible, handcrafted experience of like the book and what it means, because what it represents is something completely unique to this older style of game.
I mean, it's funny because, you know, before, I mean, everybody, the internet is just like a horrible place. And I mean, it was this magical dream, you know, we were going to share information, we were going to have hyperlinks and we were going to make websites, and the websites would have like you would mention somebody and there'd be a link to their website, you know, or something. And now everything is commercialized. So you end up in these cul-de-sacs. Like if you get, you know, you're on the Kmart site, they will never let you out of their site. You have to go back to the search engine to get to another site. And, anyway, I can talk about the toxicity of the internet endlessly, because I had devised the system for doing like a social media that was a different approach. And that, like, you were going to ask me about what, you know, how did the game company come out? And that was, it came out of, I had these ideas. I'm not a great programmer because the semantics of programming just kill me, but I can do pseudocode and come up with weird ideas. So I had this system for doing sort of a sharing ideas more creatively. And it never really panned out. I kind of want to get back to it, maybe. Like if we could get enough money together, I could pay somebody to program it for me, right? But I don't have any money.
Well, we're going to fix that. We're going to fix that by sending everybody to your Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And just, can you?
And they're all going to want PDFs and be like, you guys are jerks. You're gatekeeping elitist, snobbish jerks. And I don't like you. I'm nenever buying anything. Sorry, go on.
But what are the prices for the soft and hard, and potentially you might not know yet for this third version?
Yeah, we brought the price down to $100 for the hardbound. And when we got the soft bound that we added in, that I don't want, that I hate, that could burn on a fire, is $60. But you can get a pair of books. So if you want to like put your hardbound in a bookshelf and never touch it or leave it sealed in plastic or something, you can have like the perfect bound nice one for $20 less as sort of an add-on in addition, you know, to the other one. And then we're going to maybe do these. We don't know yet what the price point will be for these. We're thinking maybe 35 or something like that. And I mean, I don't know. It's like these, you know, people, I don't know, not, you know, I'm a gamer and I'm a game writer. I'm not a businessman. So So that kind of covers that. I'm trying to think of what else we're selling. The big thing is the art. We're doing an auction that's for the artists. And there isn't a lot of art up there. So it's really like if you want to come in and buy some of the original art from this book, you can get it. Most of the stuff we have as original pieces are maps. So you could get a pencil drawn, like, McGarry spent hours transferring the original map to a pencil drawing that he's done by hand. And you could get an original David McGarry drawing, which, David McGarry is a really significant game designer, and you could get, you could frame that and have an original dungeon map from McGarry. And then we also have the Toby Lancaster drawings, which are the production drawings that we used in the book for sale. And those are interesting too, because even with McGarry working on the dungeon, we ran into flaws into where things are. It's so involved. The number of stairwells is ridiculous. So there's some places where a stairwell didn't go to the right place, or a door was missing. So I would just cut and paste it in the layout, and move it over and Photoshop. So the ones that you get from Toby Lancaster are unique because they're a little bit different, and they don't have all the markings on them because I added those in later. All the graphic stuff, and then what else we got? Then we also, when the Kickstarter is done, if you come into the Kickstarter now, you can enter it like $5 for the art and maps level or something like that. And we have a bunch of stuff that's just a set price print. And so we have some Ken Fletcher stuff, and we have some FSF Inc., which is Martin in Norway. And we also have, I think, 10 of level 10 that are signed prints of level 10 from Toby Lancaster. So we're offering a lot of stuff. But the art thing is really, the artists came in and hauled our butts out of a sling because we lost our original artist, who's a really well-known artist. And we lost him for really, it was the typical, it was the typical thing that happens on the internet where somebody gets blamed for something and called names, and suddenly they're being erased from existence. And the comment that he made was completely taken out of context, and people didn't understand it. And I don't want to go into politics at all, so I'm just not going to do that. But we lost our artist. So then we were just like, okay, so we've got this book. We were just about to lay it out. We were just about to do all this, or we were kind of in the editing, not really editing, just proofing and maybe a little bit of finessing, you make game stuff, right?
Yeah.
How many games have you made?
Well, I've got probably 8 on the go.
Okay. Well, because I was talking to
part.
Paul Stormberg, when I told him we're so close, and he was like, yeah, you're at that 1% mark. And when you get to the 1% mark, that's when you have to do the most work. You think you've done all the work, I've been writing and I've done all this stuff. And then you get to the finishing point and you're like, we got the printed book back. The first time I opened a hardbound copy, I opened it, I looked at the page, and I was like, there's a period missing, and you can't really stop that. But we were doing that kind of, we hadn't done a book like that. Chris had done publishing before, but nothing on the level of this book, I don't think. He was doing magazines. And so magazines, it's like, you avoid the accidents, but they get in there, whatever. You write a disclaimer in the next issue. Oh, sorry, we call that painter Snotface, but that's not really his name. Move on.
But that 1% is tough to do, especially with yours, which is not PDF, right? It's permanent, right? So you got to get it right, and it's tough to finesse that last little bit. And often, even when you finish it, you look at it again and go, "Oh, we can improve upon it."
So we were in that stage, and we had our artist, and we had all this amazing art. I regret that we don't have that artist's art in it, because it is phenomenal. There's this one piece that's just the most amazing thing. I actually purchased it from the artist because I was like, this is some of the most amazing D&D art I've ever seen. And so these artists were like, oh, we can help you out. And so they just jumped on board, and they didn't, they're not getting paid millions of dollars. In some cases, people sent us stuff and they were just like, yeah, you can use this. It's something I use somewhere else, but you can license it and reuse it. And that's kind of our approach too, is that from a business perspective, like we want to be fair to our artists. And so when it comes to artwork, my preference is just to license the artwork and figure out whatever it costs to just use it. And then they can keep it and they can resell it to somebody else. They can license it to somebody else. They can do whatever they want, And so I think that's kind of a cool idea, is like, what if some of this Tonisborg art is relicensed and it comes up in another person's game book, right?
Yeah.
What do I care? It's cool. It's a great art. It needs to be out there. It'll get out there even more, right? And so it's good for the artists. And then at the same time, they have their originals. They own their originals and they can sell their originals. And artists need to make money. And so we need to come up with good ways for them to make money. So some of the artists, when we did the Kickstarter, we just put out a message. If you want to see if you can sell some art, in whatever form, you can be part of this Kickstarter. It's just that Kickstarter has not changed their interface in years.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of, like, if you're trying to do something really weird like we are, there's no method for doing that. So we're doing an auction. Well, the auction has to be on our website, and we had to get an auction widget to run the auctions through our website. And then we've got these packages that are changing the shipping costs of things, but we have no way to add it in. The only way to add in the shipping to make it reasonable for us is so that we're not losing money. Because none of the money for the art comes to us. It just goes straight to the artist. We're not taking a penny. And so the only way to do that was to go again onto BackerKit, where you have a little bit more control over shipping costs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because I do know we've been looking at Kickstarter, and if you dig in there, we've discovered that we're like that favored creator. And we were like, really? So we looked at our profile and it's like, oh, these guys have already done, they've completed 2 Kickstarters and they're on another one. We looked at some famous person's thing, and they was like, this is a person that has done 4 Kickstarters but never completed any of them.
Yeah.
It's like, do you remember the pencil dice debacle?
Actually, I don't, but I know Kickstarter and their recommendations are, to me, always a little bit murky as to how they're selected and that kind of thing.
Well, I've been looking at a couple of RPG ones, and I think it's a huge mistake for people to get on there without a product in at least a prototype stage.
Yeah.
Right. And so a lot of people, people come on board because it feels like, oh, these people seem like nice people. It feels good. I'm gonna support them. They don't have a prototype. They don't have anything. They have an incredible marketing department. Right. And so they show you all this great art, and you're going to have whatever, all these amazing things, flying ships and dragons with flared nostrils like this. And then you get to the point of doing it and they're like, oh, well, yeah, we didn't realize this was going to be hard. This is hard, producing an RPG. In our case, it took us, it's like from completion to completion of the Kickstarter might have been 3 years. It took us a while to deliver on the Kickstarter books because we were doing them at the same time as we were doing a feature film.
Yeah.
Okay. Feature film is like, you have no idea how big a project that is if you've never done one. It's huge.
Well,
and so at the same
mine was only 60 minutes, but yeah, it totally,
you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
though. Yeah.
And I had like
gigantic.
over 24 hours of footage to comb through and edit down to like 60 minutes.
Yeah.
It takes its toll.
And then so my big thing is just telling people, like, look at our track record. We do not start a Kickstarter until we have at least a draft that we can work off. We weren't inventing anything. We're just refining what we've got. And so we've got something that's ready, that's almost ready to go. My only question is kind of like, well, it's hard to know, like, as a game company, you're a game company, you're doing what I do. You make movies and you make games. And so as a game company, we don't really have a lot of access to demographics. And so we don't really know what our audience wants, which is kind of makes us better than the Evil Satan Wizards of the Coast, because Wizards of the Coast is doing everything based on focus groups and crap like that. So you're getting product that is designed for the lowest common denominator. It's like it's designed the way they design dog food packaging. You're getting dog food for your RPG from them. And and I've heard all their adventures are horrible. The only ones that are good are the ones done by gamers for gamers. And the reason is that you got a million gamers out there designing what they think is cool. And then the people who buy the things will look through them and it's just like, this one's cool, right? And so it's just kind of this organic process that creates what's good and what's bad, which is really, the best way to run your market anyway. But yeah, I mean, I one of your questions that you were going to ask me, I know, was where are you going with this? As far as what's in the plans for the future. So I thought I'd mention it since I'm heading that way. So yeah, now we don't really know we're not really sure where to go with our next product. Chris is kind of like, well, it seems like the fantasy thing is what people want, so maybe you should continue writing your Blackmoor book you're working on. But I kind of am excited. I really want to do a book that focuses that is like a treatise on role-playing elements within war games, and has like a war game. We have a war game we'd like to publish, but we could publish it with that, and then we could also publish a lot of the old artifacts that we have, like paper ephemera stuff, like maybe publish the different editions of Strategos in it as like sort of an appendix, and then do a whole section on the different elements that you can use to create Fog of War and to create something that's a little bit more of a role-played war game, right? Where your commanders, you can do anything. You can even put your commander in another room with a map, and somebody just comes in and says, here's the battle report. The troops that went up that road have encountered stiff opposition. These guys, they went into the forest. We think they're stuck in a marsh or something out there. We're not really sure. Like, you can play it like that, or you can get more rigid Kriegspiel like, and get chess gamey. But something like that. What else would I want to do? I mean, I really want to do that. Chris is kind of like, I don't know how many we can sell of that, and I'm like, well, yeah, but if we sell 100 hardbounds, it's still a good book, right? It's still pretty,
Yeah.
And then we also have several games that have never been published. I don't want to talk bad about anybody from the early days. I will just say that there was a science fiction game that was sent to TSR very early on. They had that manuscript, and then they produced a game that was almost identical early on as their own game, and didn't publish that manuscript. So we have a copy of that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then we have a sci-fi role-playing game. They had the manuscript. They never returned it. Interestingly enough, a couple of years later, they created their own sci-fi game. And David McGarry had a printout that he found when Adventure Games was closing down. He just grabbed it. He didn't know what it was. And it was called Star Master. And so that's the third in the John Snyder Star Probe, Star Empire, and Star Master game system, which follows the same prototype as Blackmoor. That's a whole other discussion. I could go down that rabbit hole for another 45 minutes. But so we have that, which because it was on printouts, we're having a what is it called? An OCR?
Optical character recognition.
Yeah,
OCR,
an OCR copy done, and so the AI is sort of being programmed to understand that particular manuscript on that printout. And so we've been just working to get an OCR of that, regardless of whether we publish it or not. But I found when we interviewed John, he just gave us his entire game collection, and so I amongst those things were pieces of his manuscript for the game, which are not in the McGarry draft. And so I have rules for handguns, for like laser guns, which he was using in his D&D campaign because it was a hybrid sci-fi fantasy thing, which Blackmoor is a hybrid. It's Sword and Planet hybrid, like all the great early campaigns. And so I also have, like, there was a little manuscript about this thick printout paper. It might have been hand typed, actually, paper. and it's his monster manual for his space game. And so that's really significant too, because when Traveller came out, they didn't really go into the alien races. It was a really weird game in a certain way, because it didn't really provide any sort of, everything was sort of generic something. I guess we're all humans, you know. And it's sort of interesting because I've met, well, Mark's a great guy. Like, you know, I'm not going to say anything bad about Mark because he's a great guy, but he's a very upstanding, good guy. You know, I think he's a fairly devout Christian. But when you play Traveller, half the time you're playing criminals. Like almost always you're like going on some raid somewhere to like doing, you know, so it's sort of funny, you know. But he didn't really put. I think they've added in all their alien races since, but it wasn't there from the inception. And so that's the interesting thing about Snyder's piece. The guy that's been working on the OCR of that is just like, yeah, this is basically, even if you don't play this game, the resources within the charts and stuff, because he, like, John is another one of those geniuses in their game group that was like, you know, an unsung hero. Like nobody goes to interview John. We did, right, for our movie, because it's like, yeah, we got to talk to the guy that played in their games, you know. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, we got that, you know, and that is mentioned by Arneson in his fanzine Corner of the Tabletop, I believe in 1973. So around 1973 is when John started writing it, talking to Bob Meyer, and he was saying like, oh yeah, we almost immediately, when we got into that campaign, we were playing a role-playing game. Okay, so it's probably the very first sci-fi RPG ever.
Yeah, that's cool, because I actually had Mark Miller as a guest on the show. I'll put a link up above. But so that came out in 77. And so 73 would predate that by 4 years. And that'd be interesting to see. I hope you guys follow through with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a matter of, we only have we have very limited resources. We aren't the giant mega corporation, satanic Nazi. I don't care anymore, you know, like I don't buy their products.
Yeah, I'm not a WotC fan, but
Hasbro, whatever.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens with that one D&D. This could be one of those moments that
I'm rooting
like an asteroid for the dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, it's gonna, if it could obliterate. I mean, they're trying to move their entire market to this computer platform thing, and it's like, we're role players, man. We sit at tables, we get Cheeto dust all over our faces and drink, you know, soda, get drunk on sugar and roll dice, right? What they're trying to,
They might lose the plot on exactly.
They're trying to dip into the Warcraft crowd, and it's like, great, go fight Warcraft, you know, go fight that company. I don't know, maybe they already own it because they own everything else, but you guys can fight it out over there. I think it's going to be wonderful if they get out of the tabletop business, because that's going to make people like us, right? We're going to become top dogs. And I don't mean like we have to dominate the market, but suddenly you're going to have more gamers going like, gosh, I really want a physical copy of something that I can roll dice with my friends around the table. And they're going to start looking for little companies that are doing good work. And so it'll be good for everybody that's an indie. Like, it's just great. It's just great. Like, yes,
continue the analogy.
D&D1.
To continue the analogy, it's like the dinosaurs asteroid, and then we're the little mammals crawling out of the rodents that crawled out of the rocks.
Yeah, I call it D&D own, because they're gonna own, like you're gonna spend money to buy things on the internet that don't exist, and so they're gonna own you. You know, you're gonna be their little. I can't say what I was gonna say next.
Well, we could probably go down for hours, and so I'll ask you this: can you come back on the show and we'll talk more about like all the kind of philosophical discussions around role playing beyond just the?
Yeah, I'd love to. You know, I'm always glad to talk to people about gaming. I mean, I love gaming. This is my favorite piece of art in the book.
Nice. Who did that one?
This one is Martin in FSF Inc. He does great stuff. you know. We have a couple, you know, like, I don't know, we have a really diverse group of artists. I hate to use that word diverse because then you're just talking about people as like tokens.
Yeah,
but
very
they are
different styles.
the artwork is diverse, you know. This is a Ken Fletcher from 1974. And it's a bunch of adventurers standing in the middle of a room with all these things coming at them. And
Yeah.
the caption is, "Fortunately, I brought along my copy of the Junior Woodchuck Handbook." You know,
Yeah.
that one's a Ken Fletcher. This one, I forgot her name, but that one's kind of a nice one. The Girl Hobbit.
Yeah.
This is very different from most of our other art. We've got, I mean, that's the thing, is I love the art in the book, and we managed to squeeze in a fair amount of art and still, you know, not overdo it. There are funny little things like these dragons. With the layout wasn't really working because the charts were so big and they're taking up half a page. And so I just sat down with a ballpoint pen and drew like these little dragons. And then I flipped them and made like a little ribbon type thing as a, what do they call that? Clip art, kind of dragon clip art. So yeah, we got just a bunch of different artists, a bunch of different styles of art. There's a comic book artist out of Canada who I always like to support his comic book. He's Von Allen does, I don't remember the name of his comic book, but vonallen.com. You can go there and you can then go online and buy his comic book, which I think is a great comic book. I mean, like, I'm not saying that just to be like, go spend money with him. It's very indicative of, like, if you like the old, like, Tintin, the old French comic books from like the 60s, 70s. It's very, very much in that style, but upgraded, but still it has something reminiscent of that era of old comic books from like European style comic books. And so I think it's kind of unique like that. Yeah, what else?
Well,
I don't know.
Well, I mean,
how long have we been going? I mean,
well, I think almost 2 hours.
Yeah, but nobody's gonna watch this. You're gonna have no viewers.
Are you kidding? That's everybody loves long form.
Look at that hairy guy. Change the channel. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have bathed first.
We're good. So okay, I'm gonna put links to your website and your Kickstarter, and let's get, and I'm gonna send it out as part of my newsletter, and we'll get the word out as best we can.
Yeah, I'll post it to all my like social stuff, my toxic stuff. Yeah, my dangerous interfaces. Yeah.
But I'd love to have you back at a future date, and we can talk more about game design philosophy and all that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, I just want to say, you know, thanks for joining me, and thanks for all the work you've done for Secrets of Blackmoor in the past, and all the history that you've archived. And I'm sure a lot of people appreciate it, just like me.
Well, and the thing about that, like what we're doing, you know, we're not, I see a lot of Kickstarters, and I think that people are just sort of like cashing in, right? You got a game, you're cashing in. A lot of small companies, I'm not saying we're the only ones that do it, but it's like, we need resources to leverage doing the other things we want to do. Like, we can't just do it, you know? And so when you buy something like a Tonisborg from us, it means like you can get, oh yeah, there was a Dave Arneson never published gangster RPG with maps and art and everything that we could do. Yeah, there's just like so much stuff we have. Like, I could go on and on about all the stuff. Like, we have never published game stuff by important designers, and we want to get it out there, you know. So yeah, I mean, if you get a Tonisborg book, I know they're high end. I just like to do really nice editions so that it's like your AD&D books, like it will last you. You know, if you have an AD&D book and you weren't a jerk with it, it's still in pretty good shape, right? This is the same sort of thing. And so if you buy a book, you're kind of supporting our project to leverage getting other unknown things out there. So that's my big spiel.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and I look forward to seeing my own version in my hand someday soon.
Oh yeah, definitely. All right. I hope it lives up to expectations. Like, I built it up so much, you're gonna be like,
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will.
Thanks, Griff. Yeah. All right. Thanks for having me on.